He was supposed to be the simplest hero in the world. A modest Soviet pilot, a smiling young man from a forgotten village who one morning left the Earth, and that same day returned as a legend. The official version of Yuri Gagarin's flight fits perfectly into a school textbook. One man, one ship, one orbit, one triumphant "let's go," one safe landing. It is clear, linear, and seemingly complete, a story without shadows. But every serious investigator knows when a story looks perfectly smooth, it usually means something has already been cut out. Our investigation does not begin on the launch pad at Baikonur, but in a dim corridor of a closed archive where the air smells of dust and old fear. Somewhere between metal shelves and identical gray folders, there is one almost invisible file marked of special importance. Inside it, there are interrogation protocols, medical conclusions, technical notes, fragments of radio transcripts, and short, nervous handwritten comments in the margins. Between the stamps and signatures, you can see omissions, crossed-out phrases, references to missing pages. It is there, in these gaps, that the outline of a different story about Gagarin's flight slowly appears. A story that was never read out from the tribunes. On the surface, nothing contradicts the official narrative. In April of the early 1960s, the Soviet Union launches the first human into space and wins a decisive ideological victory over the West. The flight is short, the trajectory is calculated to the meter, every phrase spoken on the air is rehearsed, every step of the flight plan is fixed in documentation and propaganda. The hero returns alive, the country erupts in celebrations, the world applauds. Yet if you look at the primary materials, the drafts, the internal memos, the closed reports, the smooth film begins to tremble. There are strange pauses in the radio log, gaps described later as loss of signal. There are phrases referenced in internal notes that never appear in the published transcripts. There are medical observations that do not quite fit into the image of a calm, unshaken pilot who did not see anything unusual. What if those empty minutes and blurred lines are the real center of the story? Later, when the first wave of euphoria had passed, a few people who worked around Gagarin would remember odd details. A doctor who noticed a new tension in his eyes after the flight. A communications officer who once let slip about 20 strange minutes over South America. A security officer who mentioned an unusually harsh secrecy regime around a supposedly straightforward mission. None of them had a full picture, each saw only their own fragment, and almost all of them quickly learned to push those memories back into the darkest corner of their minds. In the Soviet system, curiosity was not encouraged, especially when it concerned the first national icon of the space age. There is a second axis to this mystery, and it lies 7 years after the flight. In late March of the late 1960s, the first man in space dies in what is officially called a training accident. The explanation is technical and dry: a difficult maneuver, a loss of orientation, an irreversible dive, an impact. The commission gives the public a logical chain of events. The media wrap it in mourning rhetoric, and the story's closed. However, on the edges of that neat diagram, there are again stubborn anomalies. Witnesses talk about a bright object in the sky near the flight area. Some reports mention unusual burns on the wreckage and traces of increased radiation. These details appear, disappear, reappear in different versions of documents, as if someone cannot decide whether to erase them or leave them as a barely visible warning. Between the first flight and the final crash, one question grows like a crack under fresh paint. What exactly did Yuri Gagarin see when no one else on Earth could look out the window with him? Imagine the scene that interests us most, somewhere above the dark curve of South America, where the ocean meets the night. The official radio log later shows loss of communication. To the public, this is just a technical glitch, a routine inconvenience of early spaceflight. But in some leaked or half-remembered accounts, those same minutes take on a very different tone. They speak of Gagarin describing 3 massive objects moving parallel to his capsule, of a strange feeling that he's being watched from the outside, of a short phrase that never made it onto the record: "It is alive." If even a fragment of this is true, then the first human journey into orbit was not only a political demonstration and a triumph of engineering, it was an encounter. And if it was an encounter, then someone had to decide very quickly. Sto delit sed pravde. The system's reaction, reconstructed from hints and indirect evidence, looks ruthless and logical. Immediately after the flight, Gagarin is effectively isolated from normal life under the pretext of security and protocol. He's subjected to multi-level debriefings, military, medical, psychological, and those quiet, particularly tense conversations in rooms without windows where the questions are asked not by scientists, but by men who never introduce themselves by rank. There he's required to give a detailed written statement about everything he saw, heard, and felt in orbit. Every word is weighed, every comparison is interrogated, every doubt is recorded. Somewhere in these testimonies, according to later references, there is a detailed description of objects that behave not like space debris, not like optical illusions, and not like known satellites. There are notes about an overwhelming feeling of being studied. There is that strange line, "It is alive," which experts will later try to explain as an emotional metaphor, as the reaction of a man under extreme stress. But the fact remains, after these interrogations, a special commission of party officials, military leadership, and state security officers classifies the entire episode as a state secret of exceptional importance. Any deviation from the official story becomes, for Gagarin himself, punishable not just by disgrace, but by a tribunal. From that moment on, the bright, smiling hero becomes a prisoner of his own legend. His life after the flight looks like a golden cage. He travels, he gives speeches, he shakes hands with kings and presidents, but he's carefully kept away from real space missions. Officially, this is for his own safety. The country cannot risk its main symbol. Unofficially, as some colleagues later suggest in cautious memoirs, there is another calculation. A man who has seen something that cannot be explained should not be allowed too close to situations where he might again start speaking spontaneously, improvising, forgetting the agreed lines. And yet even within that polished public role, small cracks appear. In private conversations with close friends, he sometimes lets slip strange phrases. That we're not alone, that they are watching, that humanity has already been noticed. These remarks are quickly written off as philosophical reflections of a man who has seen the earth from above. But what if they are not metaphors? What if they are the only form in which he dares to leak at least a drop of what he really experienced in those cut-out minutes of the flight? Here our investigation takes on a clear shape. We are not trying to rewrite established historical facts or build a simple conspiracy theory. Instead, we are reconstructing an alternative layer of the same history, a layer hidden at the intersection of official documents, classified reports, personal memories, and inexplicable coincidences. We will follow Yuri Gagarin from his childhood through war, hunger, and humiliation, through his path into aviation and the brutal selection of the first cosmonaut core, into the sealed silence of the capsule where his world split in two, and finally to that last flight in the late 1960s where the official version bumps against stubborn anomalies once again. Our central question is simple and dangerous at the same time. What did Yuri Gagarin really see in space, and how could that experience have changed the rest of his life and the circumstances of his death? This is not just a story about one man. It is a story about how an entire system responds when faced with something it cannot control or fully understand. It is about the price of knowledge in a world where truth is filtered through ideology and fear. It is about how a brief contact, or even the belief that contact has occurred, can turn a national hero into the keeper of a secret too heavy for one human being. In the end, Gagarin leaves this world without giving a direct answer to the main question that has haunted dreamers, scientists, and priests for centuries. Are we alone in the universe? His silence, whether forced or chosen, turns the Gagarin mystery into something much larger than a historical puzzle. It becomes a symbol of humanity's first clumsy step toward understanding that someone, or something, might be watching us from the dark. He was born not into a world of rockets and glory, but into a world of mud, hunger, and humiliation. Long before he became a symbol of the space age, Yuri Gagarin was a small boy in an occupied village, watching grown men bow their heads to people who spoke in a foreign language and wore a different uniform. The Second World War carved itself into his childhood not as a list of dates and operations, but as empty shelves, burned houses, and the quiet desperation of adults who no longer tried to hide their fear. For a child, that fear is like a second skin. It clings to you, shapes your reactions. But sometimes it also hardens something inside, like steel cooled in ice water. In that environment, the sky above the ruined village became not only a source of danger, but also a forbidden promise. Bombers flew overhead, leaving behind fire and death. Yet the very fact that people could rise so high, command machines that crossed the clouds, planted a strange seed in the boy's imagination. He saw aircraft as something simultaneously terrifying and liberating. On the ground, you could be pushed, searched, humiliated. Up there, at least in his childish vision, you were out of reach. That contrast between being powerless on the ground and free in the sky would stay with him for the rest of his life. The war taught him two crucial skills that no training center could ever design on purpose. First, endurance, hunger, cold, and the constant awareness that you could lose everything in a single day created a patience that did not crack under pressure. Second, the ability to separate inner panic from outward behavior. In a world where a wrong glance could attract lethal attention, children learned early how to hide their real emotions behind a neutral mask. Later, in protocols and medical reports, doctors would praise Gagarin's exceptional self-control and stable psyche. They would call it an ideal trait for a pilot and a cosmonaut. Few of them understood that this composure was forged in a childhood where fear was a daily routine, not a theoretical test. Yet the war did not kill his curiosity. Paradoxically, the more destructive power he saw, the more he wanted to understand how things worked, how engines roared, how metal birds stayed in the air, how something built by human hands could overpower gravity. Scrap metal that others saw as debris became for him a puzzle. He would examine fragments of downed aircraft, touch the cold edges, trace the rivets, trying to imagine the people who had once sat inside. The same world that taught him to duck and hide also pushed him to look up and explore. It was as if the sky, despite everything, kept calling him. When peace finally came, the country he grew up in was exhausted, but obsessed with one idea: to rise again, higher and stronger than before. This obsession seeped into every school lesson, every propaganda poster, every official speech. For a boy who had already secretly chosen the sky as his direction, it felt like the entire state machine was suddenly aligned with his private dream. Aviation was not just a profession, it was a symbol of victory over humiliation, a promise that those who had once been trampled into the mud could now dictate the rules from above. His path into aviation began quietly, almost modestly, with a local flying club. On the surface, it was just another institution in an expanding Soviet system. In reality, for many young men, it was a doorway into another dimension of reality. The first time Gagarin climbed into a training cockpit, the world narrowed to metal, instruments, and the endless open space above the field. The noise of the engine, the vibration of the fuselage, the smell of fuel and oil, all of it created a new kind of silence inside him. A focused calm he had never felt on the ground. For the first time, he was not a boy reacting to forces beyond his control. He was the one moving the controls, deciding the angle of ascent, the turn, the landing. Instructors quickly noticed that this quiet young man with a simple smile behaved differently under stress. Where others tensed up, he seemed to relax. Where others overreacted to unexpected situations, he absorbed them, processed them, and responded without visible panic. It was not bravado, not the reckless confidence some pilots tried to project. It was something colder and more reliable, a kind of internal tuning that allowed him to operate clearly even when the situation was on the edge of disaster. You can call it an ideal nervous system for aviation, Or you can see in it the long echo of a childhood where fear had long ago been forced to retreat deep inside. From the flying club, he moved on to formal training at a military aviation school. Here, the romantic image of a pilot collided with hard reality. Endless theory, strict discipline, harsh physical demands. The sky was now accessed through mathematics, diagrams, and the unforgiving standards of instructors who knew exactly how many mistakes it took to die in the air. Many cadets broke under this pressure, not always physically, but mentally. The combination of fatigue, responsibility, and constant evaluation exposed every weakness. Gagarin did not look like a born champion at first glance. He was not the tallest, not the most physically imposing, but again and again, in critical situations and difficult examinations, he demonstrated the same pattern. When the pressure grew, his performance sharpened instead of degrading. His reactions remained precise, his decisions measured. The psychological profiles compiled at that time in their dry language called him calm, balanced, capable of rapid adaptation to non-standard situations. Beneath these terms lay a simple truth. He was the kind of person who could be thrown into the unknown and remain functional. His assignment to the far north, to airfields near the Arctic Circle, seemed at first like a routine step in a young pilot's career. In reality, it was another filter. Flying in the polar regions meant dealing with extreme cold, sudden weather changes, limited infrastructure, and a constant awareness that rescue, if things went wrong, might never arrive in time. It was a laboratory of borderline conditions where both machines and people were pushed close to their limits. There, above endless snow and dark forests, Gagarin's skills and character were refined even further. Colleagues remembered that he did not dramatize danger. He did not make a show of courage, did not play the hero. He simply did his job with such focused attention that it almost seemed detached. Yet in rare, relaxed moments, when the shift was over and the pilot sat over tea, his eyes lit up differently when the conversation turned to what might lie beyond the atmosphere. While others joked about aliens or repeated official slogans about the triumph of technology, he asked quieter, more serious questions. What would a person actually feel when the earth no longer filled the window? How would consciousness react when there was no familiar horizon? Would a human mind expand or crack when it realized that the blue planet was just a small ball in a much larger darkness? These were not the questions of a naive dreamer. They sounded more like the thoughts of someone instinctively preparing himself for an encounter that no manual had yet described. When the Soviet leadership decided to move from high-altitude aircraft to actual human spaceflight, the search for candidates became one of the most rigorous selection processes in the history of aviation. Officially, they were looking for healthy, physically perfect pilots with excellent reaction times and unquestionable loyalty. Unofficially, they needed something else as well, people whose minds would not disintegrate when faced with absolute novelty, people who would not start asking uncomfortable questions in the wrong company, people who could experience something extraordinary and still say the correct, approved phrases into the microphone. Gagarin entered this selection not as a legend, but as one of many. His early tests were just numbers in a long table: pulse, blood pressure, reaction times, performance under load. Yet as the examinations became more complex, his file began to stand out. Centrifuge tests, which simulated the crushing forces of launch and re-entry, showed that his body tolerated strain exceptionally well. His heartbeat quickened, his muscles protested, but his cognitive performance remained stable where others started to lose clarity. In the reports, this was described as resistance to overloads. In practice, it meant that under conditions where most people's thoughts would blur into panic, he remained capable of analysis. Then came the isolation experiments, soundproof chambers where candidates were left alone for hours or days with minimal stimuli. The goal was simple and brutal: to see how the human mind behaved when stripped of normal time markers, social contact, and environmental cues. Many subjects experienced disorientation anxiety, hallucinations. Some talked to themselves aloud, others fell into near catatonic states. And then there was Gagarin. One of the most persistent stories from those tests concerns a session in a sensory deprivation chamber. Official documents mention it only briefly, but later, among those who knew, it turned into a whispered legend. The monitoring equipment showed that he had fallen into a deep, unusual state. His eyes were open, yet his brain waves resembled those of someone asleep. When the observers finally broke the isolation and opened the chamber, he looked at him and, according to one witness, calmly said, "I see you." It was an ordinary phrase on the surface, but the way he said it unsettled them. It sounded less like a man returning from a nap and more like someone marking a transition between two layers of reality. Another note in the file described his ability to sleep with open eyes, a phenomenon rare enough to be highlighted. For the program's doctors and psychologists, this made him even more interesting. It suggested that his mind could operate on several levels at once, maintaining an outwardly functional state while withdrawing part of his awareness to some inner space. No one, at least officially, spoke about what such a mind might do or perceive when exposed to the unfamiliar emptiness of orbital flight. As the selection narrowed, the image of Yuri Gagarin within the program changed. He was no longer just a promising pilot. He became, in the internal jargon of some specialists, made for space. It was not only about his physical parameters or his photogenic smile, though both played their role. It was about a combination of traits that rarely came together in one person. Resilience born of a harsh childhood, calm forged in war, curiosity disciplined by military training, and a mind that did not fracture under isolation. Around him, an increasingly strict regime of secrecy began to form. The closer the program came to choosing a first cosmonaut, the more carefully candidates' biographies were sifted for potential unreliable elements. Gagarin's file was almost painfully tidy. No compromising relatives, no ideological slip-ups, no visible inner conflicts. His personal story could be, and later would be, turned into a textbook myth. That, too, played into the choice. The system needed a man who could stand on a podium and embody the state's narrative without visible hesitation. Yet behind the scenes in medical notes and test summaries, the picture was more complex. He was not a cardboard hero, but a man who had already spent his entire life learning to coexist with fear, uncertainty, and forces beyond his control. When doctors wrote that he adapted quickly to non-standard conditions, they meant more than just professional skill. They meant that when reality shifted, he did not try to deny it. He accepted, analyzed, and moved on. That is why, when the decision point came at Baikonur, when the question of who would be the first man to leave the planet finally had to be answered, the choice was not only about political reliability or external charisma. At some deeper, less articulated level, those responsible sensed that this particular man was more likely than others to hold his mind together if the unknown in any form suddenly stared back at him from the cockpit window. By the time Yuri Gagarin arrived at Baikonur for the final phase, the decision had already been made, in rooms he would never see. Officially, the competition among the first cosmonaut candidates was still open. Unofficially, a convergence of political needs, medical data, and quiet recommendations had pushed one name to the top of the list. He was briefed, examined, rehearsed, and watched from every angle. Yet amid all this control, there was one element no one could fully predict. What would happen in those moments when he was alone above the earth, beyond the immediate reach of any other human being? The last days before the launch were wrapped in a level of secrecy that even experienced officers found oppressive. The cosmonaut housing, the training buildings, the launch facilities, all of them formed a small, tightly sealed universe in the middle of the Kazakh steppe. Guards at every entrance, passes checked 3 times, conversations cut short when the wrong person entered the room. On paper, these measures were aimed at protecting state secrets from foreign intelligence. In practice, they also served to isolate the chosen man from anything that might unsettle him or disrupt the carefully constructed narrative he would carry into space. Gagarin's schedule in those days was a mix of the familiar and the surreal. There were technical briefings where engineers walked him through systems he already knew almost by heart. The capsule layout, the control panels, the emergency procedures. There were medical checks confirming again and again that his body was ready to endure the violence of launch and re-entry. There were short stage meetings with reporters and officials where every phrase was tested for ideological purity. And then there were the other meetings, the ones held in smaller rooms with fewer people and no cameras. In one such room, with the blinds half closed and the light slightly too bright, he sat across from men who introduced themselves not by rank but by their function. Guardians of state security. Their questions were not about switches or orbits. They were about loyalty, about discipline, about what he would do if he saw something that did not match the prepared script. They reminded him politely but firmly that everything he would experience in orbit, everything he would say into the microphone, everything he would later recall in debriefings would be classified as a matter of national importance. There were phrases about state secret, special regime, personal responsibility before the party and the people. Somewhere between the lines, the message was clear. Your eyes belong to us now. For a man who had lived his entire adult life inside a system that claimed the right to define reality, this was not a shock. Gagarin understood perfectly that his flight was first and foremost a political act. Yet even he felt, in those last conversations, a new weight pressing on him. Not just the weight of representing his country, but the weight of being the sole witness to a world no one else had ever seen directly. That witness was being preemptively bound, framed, limited. Whatever he would feel up there, whatever he would truly think, only a tiny part of it would be allowed to reach other human minds. On the night before launch, sleep came to him in brief, fractured segments. Technicians moved quietly through the corridors, voices murmured behind doors. The air carried the mixed smell of metal, dust, and the steps cold. When he closed his eyes, he saw not just the familiar diagrams of the flight path, but something else as well. He also thought, in a quieter corner of his consciousness, of the moment when the engines would shut down and the usual sense of down and up would vanish. On the launch pad, as he climbed into the cramped interior of the Vostok spacecraft, the world outside narrowed to metal and procedure. Technicians checked straps, connected cables, closed hatches. Voices crackled in his headset, running through final checklists. Each phrase, each call and response had been rehearsed so often it almost felt like theater. Yet there was nothing theatrical about the physical sensations that followed. The rising vibration, the mounting roar, the way the entire structure seemed to tense like a living creature preparing to leap. And then the moment came. The engines ignited, the rocket shuddered, and the weight on his chest began to grow. The forces pressing him into the seat were like an invisible hand, relentless and indifferent. The ground fell away, though from his vantage point there was no ground, only the numbers on the instruments and the familiar cadence of controllers' voices reporting altitude, velocity, trajectory. Vostok rose through layers of atmosphere, through cloud and turbulence, into thinning air and finally beyond it, into a zone where traditional human experience had simply never existed. The official record of what happened next is tidy. The rocket reached the planned orbit, the engines cut off. Gagarin reported the onset of weightlessness, described the beauty of the Earth, commented on the clarity of the horizon, the thinness of the blue line of atmosphere. These phrases were transmitted, recorded, and later turned into a kind of verbal monument. School children would memorize them. Documentaries would play them over triumphant music, and for most of the world, this would be all there was to know. Inside the capsule, however, the experience was not a series of prepared lines. When the force on his body suddenly vanished, replaced by an uncanny lightness, he felt his inner sense of orientation dissolve. The planet that had always been below was now simply there, a glowing disk floating in darkness. Familiar concepts like up and down became meaningless. His body adapted quickly as training had shown it would, but his mind needed longer to process the sight in the small window, the curved, luminous edge of the earth, the slow movement of clouds like breath, the black beyond, so absolute it almost seemed solid. He reported what he was supposed to report. The words about the beautiful blue earth sounded sincere because they were. The sight was breathtaking, humbling, overwhelming. Yet even as he spoke, another layer of awareness uncoiled inside him, the part of his mind that had always asked the question, what else is out there? Not in a poetic sense, but in a literal physical one. If humanity had finally managed to send one of its own into this darkness, what if someone, or something, had done the same long before? The orbit carried him across continents and oceans, over countries that had built their own narratives about this very flight. Below, borders and conflicts shrank to invisible lines, irrelevant from his vantage point. The earth looked unified, vulnerable, unspeakably small. It should have been a purely uplifting revelation, and for a while it was. Then came the segment of the flight that would later be remembered in most public documents as a loss of communication. As Vostok moved over the shadowed curve of South America, the flow of words between the capsule and ground control changed. Officially, there were technical reasons. The limits of ground station coverage, the angles of transmission, the inevitable imperfections of early space communication. There was indeed a gap in the public radio record, a span of minutes in which the hero and the country, according to released logs, simply fell silent to each other. What happened inside those minutes has never been confirmed in any open archive. Yet in leaked fragments, in whispered recollections, in odd references buried in secondary documents, a different version of events surfaces and refuses to disappear. In that version, it began not with a sound, but with a feeling. At first, Gagarin noticed nothing unusual. The instruments behaved normally. The view in the window showed the expected portion of the Earth's surface, partially obscured by darkness. Then, almost imperceptibly, a new awareness pressed itself into his perception. The sense that something was moving alongside him, not turbulence, not vibrations, but a presence. Pilots know this sensation from formation flights, when another aircraft holds position nearby. The body learns to feel the proximity of another moving mass even before the eyes confirm it. He turned his attention toward the window. There, beyond the thin rim of the capsule, in the region where the dark of space met the faint glow of the atmosphere, he saw them. 3 objects, huge compared to anything human-made he had ever seen in the sky, yet distant enough that their exact size was impossible to judge. They did not flash like meteors, did not flicker like stars. They held formation, moving parallel to his trajectory, matching speed with unnerving precision. There were no visible wings, no exhaust, no familiar forms. Each one glowed faintly from within, as if made of condensed light rather than solid metal. His training clashed with his instincts. The pilot in him wanted to categorize them: aircraft, satellites, reflections, instrument glitch. The man who had spent his childhood tracing the outlines of unknown machines in the sky felt at a deeper level something else entirely. That these things were not random, not accidental, not byproducts of physics. They behaved as if they were observing. He spoke. According to the alternative accounts, his voice, tight but controlled, reached ground control with a delay and distortion that the official record later erased. He described 3 large objects moving alongside the ship, noted their stability, their synchronized motion. He reported a powerful impression of being watched. At some point, searching for words that did not exist in any instruction manual, he said a phrase that would later become the nerve center of the entire forbidden story. It is alive. From the ground in this reconstruction, responses were sharp, urgent, layered with static and competing voices. Controllers demanded clarification, asked about the instruments, queried whether he might be experiencing visual disturbances. Somewhere in the background, in a less formal channel, other voices likely asked different questions about his mental state, about the possibility of optical illusions caused by the capsule's window, about whether external light sources could be creating false images. Yet throughout this exchange, the objects did not behave like illusions. They held position, then slowly shifted, as if assessing him from several angles. At moments, he reported, in descriptions that would later vanish into classified files, that their inner glow intensified as if responding to his attention. There was no threat in their movement, no sudden aggression. If anything, the behavior resembled curiosity. Then, just as gradually as they had appeared, they began to recede. Not with the abruptness of something breaking off pursuit, but with the slow, deliberate distancing of observers satisfied for the moment with their data. They drifted away into the black, their glow fading until they could no longer be distinguished from the ordinary stars. Communication, at least in the official logs, resumed its normal pattern. Gagarin continued the flight. He reported systems parameters, described the Earth, followed procedures. Outwardly, the mission unfolded according to plan. Inside his mind, however, a line had been crossed. The question, "Are we alone?" was no longer philosophical. It had turned into a memory, vivid and undeniable, strapped to his consciousness in the same way he was strapped into the capsule. Near the end of the orbit, just before the critical phase of re-entry, a second episode occurred in some versions of the hidden story. An episode even more difficult to articulate than the sighting of the three objects. As Vostok prepared for descent, the boundary between Earth and space shifted once again in his perception. Somewhere ahead of the capsule, in a region that should have been pure darkness, an intense light flared, not a point, but a field, a curtain of brightness that seemed to form not in front of him, but around him, as if the space itself had become illuminated from an invisible source. For a moment, he was blinded, his instruments a blur, his sense of physical orientation dissolving in white. Then, layered over the flood of light, images began to appear. He saw the Earth as if from much farther away than his current orbit, suspended in a web of fine, glowing lines. These lines crisscrossed the planet, connecting points and regions he could not name in that instant. They resembled neither longitude and latitude nor any known mapping. They looked more like a network, a lattice drawn not by human hands but by some other system of organization. At the nodes of this web, countless points of light pulsed as if clusters of attention were focusing and releasing again. From the depth of the illuminated field, something larger stepped, not literally, but in terms of presence. He could not describe its shape in later accounts, if those accounts indeed existed, because the shape did not fit into any earthly category. It was an object only in the sense that his mind needed a noun. It was enormous, dwarfing the scale of his ship, dwarfing even the Earth in its conceptual size. It felt less like a separate body and more like a concentration of awareness, like the focal point of a gaze that had just chosen to become visible to him. And with that presence came what witnesses would later call a mental message. There were no words, no sound, no recognizable language. Instead, there was a flood of understanding that bypassed the usual channels of speech. Concepts printed themselves directly into his thoughts. One of them was simple and terrifying. "We are watching you." Another, more complex one, carried the sense of waiting, of a long, patient observation of a species that had just begun to scratch at the borders of its cradle. Humanity, in this silent communication, appeared not as a center of the universe, but as one of countless developing phenomena in a vast field of attention. Then, as suddenly as it had arisen, the light diminished. The web of lines faded. The massive presence retreated beyond what his mind could track, and the cockpit returned, cramped, metallic, filled with the familiar indicator lights and the strict demands of re-entry procedures. He was a pilot again. He separated the modules, endured the heat of descent, prepared for landing. Whatever he had just experienced, he placed it in a compartment of his mind he could not afford to open until he was safe on the ground. The official narrative from this point to touchdown remains largely uncontested. The descent was rough but successful. He ejected at the planned altitude, descended by parachute, landed on Soviet soil. The first people he met were bewildered locals who suddenly saw an orange-suited figure on their fields. The state moved quickly, recovered the capsule, secured the landing zone, began processing the hero, not as a man who had just undergone an unthinkable experience, but as a symbol to be presented to the world. Yet within hours, the other process also began. Instead of being allowed to rest, Gagarin was drawn into a different orbit, that of debriefings, interrogations, layered conversations with different groups of authorities. Engineers asked about the systems. Doctors asked about his physical sensations. Psychologists, with polite smiles, asked about his emotional state, his impressions, his thoughts during the flight. And then the security officials representing a structure whose existence depended on controlling information asked their questions. In a handwritten statement, if we follow the line of the hidden story, he was required to describe in detail every unusual observation he had made. He wrote about the three objects, about their trajectory, their behavior, his impression that they were coordinated, not random. He tried clumsily to put into words the second episode, the overwhelming light, the vision of the earth in a web of luminous lines, the sense of a vast presence, and the mental message that they are watching and waiting. Each of these elements was evaluated, discussed, dissected, not by philosophers, but by committees. For the military, the possibility that unknown objects could accompany a Soviet spacecraft without being detected by ground systems was unacceptable. For the political leadership, the idea that the first man in space had been confronted with something beyond human control was dangerous. For the security apparatus, the riskiest factor was the man himself, the one person who had seen and felt all this directly. The response was as decisive as it was predictable. At the highest level, the entire set of anomalous observations was classified under a special regime. They were labeled as state secrets of extraordinary importance. Any references to them in public documents were removed or rewritten. The official radio transcripts were edited to exclude the relevant segments, a process justified by the need to remove technical noise. Within closed circles, the phenomenon was filed under various euphemistic headings: unidentified phenomena, unexplained visual impressions, psychophysiological reactions under stress. As for Gagarin, the conclusion was clear. He would be the perfect public hero. But precisely when he stepped out of the capsule and into the open air of his own planet again, Yuri Gagarin became something no training manual had ever prepared him for. Not a pilot, not a cosmonaut, but a global icon. The world greeted him with applause and banners. Leaders lined up to shake his hand. Children learned to draw his smile before they could write their own names. The state wrapped him in medals, parades, and official visits. On paper, the first man in space had received the highest reward imaginable. In practice, it was a very elegant cage. Under the pretext of security and national pride, he was quietly removed from the front line of real spaceflight. Officially, the argument was reassuring. The country could not risk its greatest symbol in another dangerous mission. Unofficially, there was a quieter fear. A man who had seen something that could not be controlled might one day decide to speak about it without permission. It was safer if he spent his days cutting ribbons, delivering rehearsed speeches, and smiling for cameras than sitting in a cockpit on the edge of the unknown again. His everyday life after the flight became a strange pattern of repetition: ceremonies, official receptions, speeches in front of factory workers and school children, endless trips abroad where he played the role of living evidence that the Soviet system was capable of miracles. Every itinerary was carefully planned, every conversation monitored, every spontaneous question redirected towards safe topics. The more the world saw him, the less he was allowed to be himself. At first he accepted this role with genuine enthusiasm. He understood that he was not just speaking for himself, but for his country, for science, for all those who had made his flight possible. But as months turned into years, the gap between his public and private selves widened. In public, he repeated the same phrases about the beauty of the Earth from orbit, about the triumph of human reason, about the bright future of space exploration. In private, in rare, carefully chosen company, other words began to slip through. To a close friend, over tea in a quiet kitchen, he might say, "We're not alone." To a trusted colleague, during a walk far from microphones, he might remark that "someone is watching us, I'm sure of it." These were not drunken tales or attempts to impress. Those who heard them later recalled that he spoke softly, almost reluctantly, as if every such phrase was a small violation of an oath he had once been forced to take. He never told the full story. He never drew diagrams, never wrote anything down. But the essence was always the same. What he had seen in space had convinced him that Humanity was under observation. The system noticed. Reports from those who spent time with him, written in dry, bureaucratic language, occasionally mentioned philosophical reflections on the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence or tendencies toward metaphysical interpretation of cosmic experience. These phrases were mild, almost harmless on the page. Yet behind them lurked the old anxiety of the state, uncontrollable narratives. If the first man in space began to frame his flight as an encounter with an external intelligence, the entire carefully constructed ideological picture would start to crack. One way to mitigate that risk was to deny him the very thing he wanted most, to fly again. Gagarin's longing to return to real flight never disappeared. The more he traveled the world as a symbol, the more he missed the concrete reality of engines, checklists, and the honest, simple logic of machines. Theoretical discussions about the future of cosmos in front of microphones did not satisfy the part of him that had been shaped by cold airfields and tight cockpits. He enrolled in a military academy, studied diligently, and worked to regain his status as an active pilot. Officially, this fit perfectly with the narrative of a hero who continued to serve his country. Unofficially, it began to worry those who had once decided that his mind held information better left in the dark. There are accounts that during this period he occasionally made half-joking, half-serious remarks to fellow pilots, that he would like to see them again, that there were things in the sky we're not told about. In isolation, such phrases could be dismissed as cosmic romanticism, but nothing in his life was considered in isolation anymore. Conversations were noted, evaluated, stored. The file bearing his name never stopped growing. As he returned to flight training with another experienced pilot, Vladimir Seryogin, the two men formed a partnership based not on myth, but on shared professional respect. They flew together, trained together, tested each other's reactions. For Gagarin, these flights were a return to reality, a chance to feel again the direct, unmediated connection between his own decisions and the behavior of a machine. For the system, however, every hour he spent in the cockpit restored a possibility they had once tried to eliminate, that he might again find himself face to face with something outside their control. In the weeks leading up to the fatal flight in late March of the late 1960s, there are reports, never officially confirmed, that he spoke with unusual intensity about the feeling that time was running out. One such conversation allegedly picked up in a monitored environment, has him saying that the upcoming flights would be very important and that he must understand. The exact context is unclear. To some, it sounds like the determination of a man eager to prove he could still fly. To others, reading between the lines, it carries a different tone, the stubborn resolve of someone who has lived for years with an unanswered question and feels he's approaching his last chance to pursue it. The 27th of March arrived as just another day on the calendar, yet in retrospect it stands out like a fracture line across an entire era. The official version of what happened on that training flight is straightforward. Gagarin and Seryogin took off in a jet for a routine mission. During the flight, their aircraft supposedly executed a sudden maneuver to avoid an unexpected object, possibly another aircraft, possibly a weather balloon. The maneuver led to a loss of stability, a dive, and finally a crash into the forested ground. The investigation cited a combination of factors: possible communication errors, weather conditions, pilot reaction. The conclusion presented to the public was sad but comforting: a tragic accident in the risky profession of military aviation. Yet from the very beginning, shadows gathered around this explanation. Witnesses in nearby areas spoke of seeing a bright object in the sky shortly before the crash, something that did not resemble a conventional plane or meteorological device. Some described an unusual glow, others a sudden flash that seemed to hang in the air rather than move. Their testimonies did not fit neatly into the technical framework of the official report. Some were not recorded at all. Others were quietly filed away, marked as unreliable or subjective. Members of the search teams that reached the crash site later spoke often, only years afterward, about details that still troubled them: unusual burn patterns on fragments of the aircraft, A level of radiation slightly higher than the background norm in that area quickly explained away as instrument error or natural variation. Scorch marks on nearby trees that did not correspond cleanly to the expected trajectory of the falling plane. None of these elements, taken alone, can definitively overturn the official version. Together, they form a pattern of dissonance, like a melody that does not resolve into the chord it promises. Within closed circles of engineers and officers, other possibilities circulated in whispers. Some suggested that another, larger aircraft might have passed too close to Gagarin's jet, creating a wake that forced an unexpected maneuver. Others proposed technical malfunctions, abrupt changes in weather, or even human error somewhere in the chain of command. And then there were those, fewer in number but stubborn in their doubts, who pointed back to the anomalies of his spaceflight and asked a forbidden question. What if what he encountered in orbit had not been a one-time event? In support of their unease, they pointed to scattered hints from the archives of the early space program. In one of Sergei Korolev's personal notes, written not long before his own death, there is a line that some interpret as a confession of fear, a vague mention that, if they return, we must be ready. The pronoun is ambiguous. It could refer to foreign aircraft, to abstract enemies, to anything at all. But for those already inclined to see a connection, it became one more shard in a mosaic of unspoken anxiety. There were also references, in internal KGB documents, to a file with an innocuous yet ominous title, On the Observation of Unidentified Phenomena. It reportedly collected testimonies from pilots, radar operators, and even some cosmonauts who had encountered strange objects or effects in the sky. Most of these reports were stamped, classified, and buried. Publicly, the state mocked the very idea of unidentified flying objects as pseudoscience or foreign propaganda. Privately, it cataloged each case with meticulous care. Gagarin's name appears in this reconstruction on more than one page of that file. His family, for their part, maintained dignified silence. They did not give sensational interviews, did not feed conspiracies, did not publicly contradict the official line. Perhaps this was their way of protecting his image, or perhaps they knew that any open challenge would lead not to truth, but to more pressure and more pain. Other cosmonauts in later years alluded to strange things seen in orbit, flashes, objects, sensations that could not be fully explained. Most of them spoke cautiously, choosing their words with the delicacy of people who had spent their lives under regimes of secrecy. Standing at the intersection of all these threads, one cannot help but see Gagarin's story as something larger than the biography of a single man. It is the story of how humanity's first step beyond its cradle was immediately entangled in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of knowledge that could not be turned into propaganda slogans. The first man to look down on the Earth from orbit seems also to have been the first to look directly at a reality his own civilization was not ready to face. In this light, his death becomes more than a tragic accident or a closed case in an archive. It becomes a symbol of the price that may be demanded when truth collides with systems built on managing perception. Whether or not his final flight had anything to do with the phenomena he encountered in space, the fact remains. The one person who could have told the full story, in his own words, without filters or redactions, left this world without doing so. We are left with fragments. A childhood under occupation that taught him to live with fear and keep his face calm. A path into aviation that proved his mind could function on the edge of disaster. Training experiments that hinted at a consciousness capable of operating in altered states. A flight in which official transcripts do not quite match the whispered memories of those who saw the raw data. Years of golden captivity during which a man who had seen too much was allowed to say only what suited the story others wanted to tell. A final crash surrounded by unresolved questions and carefully managed answers. The Gagarin mystery in this sense is not just about whether he saw three vast objects matching his orbit, or whether some unimaginable presence once cast the image of the Earth in a luminous web across his mind. It is about something even more unsettling, the possibility that the answer to the oldest human question Are We Alone was entrusted for a few brief minutes to a single human consciousness and then locked away not by cosmic forces, but by human institutions. Yuri Gagarin carried that answer, or at least his version of it, to his grave. In the decades since his death, our instruments have become more precise, our satellites more numerous, our telescopes more powerful. Yet we still do not have a universally accepted proof that someone is watching us. What we do have is a legend of a man who went first, saw something that did not fit into any existing theory, tried to speak of it as best he could, and then lived and died within a system that treated that experience as a threat rather than a gift. That legend may never be fully verified. Documents can remain classified, testimonies can disappear, physical traces can be explained away, but legends play a different role in human history. They mark the places where our certainties are weakest, where the ground under our feet feels thin. The secret of Gagarin has become precisely such a marker, a symbol of the broader mystery that surrounds humanity's first contact with the wider universe, whether that contact was real, misunderstood, or only half remembered through the lens of one man's extraordinary mind. In the end, the most honest conclusion may be the least satisfying. We do not know exactly what he saw. We only know that after his flight he could no longer see humanity as alone, and that this conviction cost him more than anyone around him was willing to admit. Somewhere in the silent vacuum beyond our atmosphere, the path of his tiny capsule still traces an invisible line around the planet. Along that line, for a few brief minutes, the eyes of one human being met something in the dark. The fact that we turned that moment into a secret says as much about us as any answer about them ever could.